Thank you, Anis. Good afternoon, everyone. It is my absolute honor today to introduce Ben Phillips to deliver his keynote address at the inaugural Hasanah Forum. To be honest, it's a tall order for me today. I mean, how do you introduce someone who has spent his formative years witnessing Nelson Mandela in action? But I'll try. Since starting out as a teacher and activist in South Africa, Ben has spent decades devising and leading grassroots campaigns and advising governments and the UN develop sound and effective social policies and programs. His learnings undoubtedly come from a deep field experience and from witnessing ordinary people unite against inequality. Ben has recently authored a seminal book titled How Do You Fight Inequality and Why That Fight Needs You? And I highly recommend every person interested in issues of inequality or development immerse yourself in that. Among his several accolades and hats, Ben co-founded the Fight Inequality Alliance, which is a global network of development actors that are building a movement tackling unjust distribution of wealth and address the inequalities people are experiencing on an everyday basis. Commendably, all proceeds and royalty from the sale of his book will be channeled to the work of the Alliance. Currently based in Rome, he likes to spend his time walking his dog, who along with his cat, I believe, attend some of his virtual meetings. We are hoping they too will make an appearance today. Hope you will have your questions ready for him later. In the meantime, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Ben Phillips. Over to you, Ben.
Thank you. Thank you, Aditi. It's such a delight to be with you. Thank you to the Yayasan Hasanah for facilitating this forum with civil society, business and government on how we make that shift from charity to justice. And I really look forward also to a time when we can be together face to face in Malaysia for conversations like this. It's a great privilege to be with you and to be able to offer some reflections about this era of rising inequality across the world. And I'm also keen to hear your questions and your own reflections today as well. I'm an activist, I'm an organizer, I'm a UN advisor, and I'm an author on inequality. And I speak from all those perspectives today. Some of what I talk about is covered in this book, How to Fight Inequality and Why That Fight Needs You. I won't have the time to describe the whole book, so I'll just give a little bit of an introduction to some of the ideas and how they relate to the conversations that you're having today. Now, we talk about inequality in a time of crisis, but one way of looking at it is to recognize that these crises are themselves driven by inequality. Inequality is the crisis behind these crises. Some good news is that crises can also offer an opportunity to break out of inequality. But here's the challenging news, and perhaps the most important news. You might think it's bad news. I think it's good news. That what happens next is up to us. So if you're watching this and listening to this discussion and thinking that you're a spectator, you're not a spectator, you're on the pitch. Now, you're absolutely right to be worried about inequality. Before the COVID crisis, about 7 in 10 people lived in countries where inequality was getting worse. And since the COVID crisis began, it's now probably 10 in 10 people live in countries where inequality is getting worse. The ILO has noted that workers have lost about $3.7 trillion. And Forbes magazine have noted that billionaires have gained about $3.9 trillion. So in other words, there's been a transfer of wealth during this crisis, this time of desperate need, from workers to billionaires of about $4 trillion. And at this time of most acute need, most developing countries are set to slash spending on public services in the coming year. Now, as Wilkinson and Pickett noted in their classic book, The Spirit Level, inequality is a public bad That is, we all suffer from inequality, not just those who are squeezed down by it. Here's one way of looking at it. The worse that inequality gets, the worse the murder rate gets, the worse the violent crime gets, and even the worse obesity gets, and the worse teen pregnancy gets. You can plot on a graph how unequal is a country on one axis, and on the other axis, you can track the proportion of people who work as private security guards. In other words, the more unequal a country, the less trusting, the more that we fear each other. It's like pulling an elastic until it snaps. Inequality is holding back our progress on poverty, it's lessening social mobility, it's undermining social cohesion, it's threatening peace, it's hurting democracy. It's holding back our ability to tackle climate change, both because of the huge share of emissions of the global elite, and also because of the power of wealthy people to stop progress on tackling climate change. And it's even bad for the economy, as even the IMF now recognizes. I used to have to spend a lot of time setting out why inequality is bad. Now I don't have to. People say, yeah, we get that. Now get on to what do we do about it? So let me get on to what can we do about it. For my book, How to Fight Inequality, I looked back at when inequality had been beaten in the past, because I wanted to learn from history, from what had worked. Now, there are two major blocks or clusters of when inequality has been tackled successfully in a multi-country way, in a multi-year way. The first is from the 21st century, and that is Latin America from about the year 2000 to about the year 2010 or 2015, when about 8 to 11 countries substantially reduced inequality. There's a much longer running case going across a much greater number of countries, but that's from the 20th century. And that includes newly independent African and Asian countries in the 50s and 60s. It includes the progress that took place in Malaysia later from the 70s. It includes Europe from about 1945 or before, and it includes the US from the 1930s, amongst others. And in most cases, that period ends, though not all, around about 1980, or sometimes earlier, sometimes a bit later. Now, the first thing to note about when people successfully tackled inequality is that it is a policy question. By that I mean, when I looked back, and this is 150 years of history, I'm looking back across 2 centuries, across every continent. I can't find a single example where any country has substantially or sustainably reduced inequality through community or NGO projects alone, or through private initiative, through corporate responsibility, or through market self-correction. Every single time it required government policy. Now, there's no one silver bullet policy, but the policy mix is not really so much of a mystery. When I looked back at Brazil and the Latin American cases, these are really the only cases from this century, the 21st, I found these policies: money in the hands of ordinary people, wage increases and rights at work, expansion of public services, progressive taxation, land reform, and tackling discrimination, amongst others. Now, crucially, no single one of these policies is enough to tackle inequality. So sometimes when World Bank types, for example, describe the progress in Brazil, they try and put it entirely down to Bolsa Familia. That was the program that put cash in the hands of parents. And that does matter, it did matter. But on its own, if only that policy had been followed, it wouldn't have reduced inequality. It was the package, but that package is not so much of a mystery. And the really strange thing was, when I then went back and I looked at the 20th century cases, and this includes looking at these African and Asian cases, it also includes looking at what happened in the US, it also includes the Scandinavian welfare state. What's fascinating is how much of the same package takes place across centuries, across contexts. So the bigger issue then than the policy mix is the politics mix. Now, I don't mean this in a partisan sense. What I mean is the social processes that enable the policy shifts to tackle inequality. And here's the key one that I found. Every single time, the policies were never dependent only on good leaders. They always required pressure from below, every time. even when there were good leaders. This is not about saying leaders are bad. Lyndon B. Johnson, president of the US, who played such a key role in the Great Society, in tackling discrimination, in improving the welfare of ordinary people, he said this to Martin Luther King. He said, look, I know what I have to do, but you have to make me do it. So what are the 3 big lessons for how ordinary people can make a difference? The first is about building power through organizing. So when I met with those Brazilians, for example, who had played such a key role in tackling inequality, ordinary Brazilians, landless workers, one group I met were the women who collect coconuts from the forests and from the big estates. And they had successfully campaigned for a law that protects their right to do so. Their history was that they were the descendants of people who'd been enslaved and had run away to the forest, had lived in the forest, lived off the forest, but had not been the legal owners of the forest. But that hadn't mattered because the forest wasn't worth very much. But as soon as the forest became worth something, those people were under threat because they were sitting on land that technically belongs to someone else, even though it was the only home that they had ever known. There's now a law that says that they have a right going beyond property rights to the fruits of the forest. They got that because they pushed for it, because they organized. This is a group of women who were illiterate. They taught themselves to read. They taught themselves how to form a group. And through pressure, they won these. They also won a guaranteed minimum price for their products. They won free public preschool for small children. They won access to water and sanitation. Here's what they told me. They said, individually, we coconut breakers are small. When we organized, we became visible. Everything we achieved, they said, has been through the strength of our friendship. They linked together in their community. They linked with communities in the region. They got support, in their case, from the trade unions, from the Catholic Church, and from the wider public. They started an association. On their t-shirts, it said this phrase, Organizadas somos fortes. That means, organized, we are strong. If we look at Ghanaian independence, just to give one example of the process that happened in Africa and Asia post-independence, it was the trade unions in Ghana that played such a massive role in securing independence. And for them, independence didn't just mean replacing foreign leaders with Ghanaian leaders. It meant that every Ghanaian would have a basic set of opportunities. So the cocoa workers led to a cocoa board, which meant that the profits from cocoa didn't just go to a small minority, but went to the whole country. It led to a rollout of free education, firstly to cocoa workers and later to everyone. In the US, from the 1930s to the 1970s, when we look at what was it that led to the New Deal, what led it to civil rights and beyond, again, we find a combination of pressure from below, a coalition, a kind of Venn diagram, Black organizations, trade unions, activist groups, and people like A. Philip Randolph, who was a Black activist, trade unionist, are kind of in the middle of that Venn diagram. Now, when we talk of movements, it's really important to stress, we're not talking just about the famous leaders. A lot of people know the story of Rosa Parks, or they think it's the story of Rosa Parks. This is the story of the Black woman that refused to move to the back of the bus. And the story that people learn is that Black people in the States were forced to sit at the back of the bus, and then one day Rosa Parks refused to, and then Martin Luther King gave a speech, and then the law changed. That isn't what happened. What happened was this. For 2 years, a group of African-American women, of whom Rosa Parks was one, but a group, planned this. After it launched, it took 1 more year of a boycott of the buses in order to beat the bus companies economically in order to win the struggle. Martin Luther King was not the organizer. He himself, who was from a different town, from Atlanta, Georgia, from a different state, he himself said, it wasn't my idea, I'm not the organizer, I didn't initiate it, I'm not running it. I was merely asked to come and speak in support. Now, how do you beat such a powerful company? You have to get every single Black worker to work from their house for a year, every day. That's not one great speech, that's logistics, that's organizing, and that's holding together. The postmen were involved because they knew where everyone was. They could plot out the routes. Every single church was involved in that town. That was where people met on Sunday. That was where they organized. So as the lawyer for the Montgomery bus boycott argued, it was the whole town, it was every single person that won that change. Numbers are key and organizing is key. In Scandinavia, I talked about how the Scandinavian welfare state came about, because I used to think, as someone who's an admirer of Scandinavia, that there was something intrinsic about the egalitarian culture of Scandinavia. But something struck me whilst I was living in the States, which was that I came across many Americans who were descended from Scandinavians. Now, I know from my own history the Irish story of people who emigrated from Ireland because of the way that the British state kept such tyranny, such cruelty that kept people in great hunger. But I started to hear stories from people from Scandinavia that in some ways were similar, that their ancestors had fled famine. I couldn't believe it. How could such an egalitarian culture have allowed famine? And the answer was this: because it wasn't then an egalitarian culture. It was a grinding, cruel, feudal state. But ordinary workers from the towns, together with the rural poor, small farmers, started to organize. The elite's reaction was not to accept what they were doing. The elite's reaction was to try to crush it. Norway, the Norwegian government, even hired militia to kill strikers. They used strike breakers. But those on strike held firm. They kept together, they organized. So in other words, that is what ultimately led to the compromise, to this system that we now see as intrinsically Scandinavian. It's not a triumph of culture, it's a triumph of organization. If they can have it, anybody can. Cesar Chavez, who organized farm workers in the US, he put it so succinctly and so beautifully. He said, "We don't need perfect political systems. We need perfect participation." A second lesson is the vital need to create a new story. Whenever I looked back at how inequality had been tackled, it always took a time. You always had to hold together for a period, and it was never one policy. So for that, you needed a cohesive story, a story that inspired people, a story that touched their moral core. Sometimes progressives say, look, we're scientists, we're experts. We don't do myths and stories. If you don't do myths and stories, you'll lose. As the great union organizer Joe Hill said, a pamphlet, no matter how good, is never read more than once, but a song is learned by heart and repeated over and over again. In Britain, the phrase welfare state came not from a policy one or from a politician, but from the Archbishop of Canterbury, talking about the suffering that people had gone together through the war and about the need to recast society afterwards. There's a beautiful Mexican movie. I hope that you go see it if you haven't seen it already. It's called Roma, and it's about domestic workers. Now, after this movie came out, not only was it a big hit across the world and the pride of Mexico, but it helped shift a policy in Mexico, which was that for the first time ever, domestic workers secured through parliamentary legislation key rights at work. Here's the interesting thing. That movie makes zero policy recommendations. What it did was change the national story. I learned in Ireland this wonderful saying: history is written by the rulers, but the sufferers write the songs, and in the end, the music wins. Here's a more challenging lesson, perhaps one of the hardest ones. It's that every single time I found progress against inequality, the people that led it were seen as troublemakers. They had to be undeferential. Now, right now in the States, some people seeing the Black Lives Matter protests ask, why can't they be more like Martin Luther King? Why do they have to make such a ruckus? But in 1966, 63% of Americans said that Martin Luther King was divisive. Civil rights leader John Lewis talked about the importance of good trouble. Whether you're talking about the suffragettes in England who pushed for the right to vote, anti-slavery campaigners, the the movements for independence, the movements for rights at work. Every single time at the beginning, those folks were seen as troublemakers. One of the best clues about who will be on the stamps of tomorrow is to look at who's being stamped on today. What are the implications then for us, for those who want to bring change? So first, a word to friends in business. And this is a challenging one. Now, it is good to do philanthropy. It does make a difference. I've seen it with my own eyes. But as multimillionaire entrepreneur Jafar Shalki said to me, he said he had set up his foundation as a philanthropist, but he also came to learn that it's not enough. He'd seen too often one village changed, but the next village left behind. He came to realize this: philanthropy alone will not ensure opportunity for all, will not heal the growing anger in the world, or enable societies to overcome the social and economic crisis that has come with COVID. Only the redistribution of wealth through tax-funded government action, accountable to the public, can do that. Likewise, CSR work, trying to be the best type of business, can help pioneer and model. But to tackle inequality at a national level, we need to reshape the core of all business, which means shifting wages and conditions and the voice of employees by right. It means that we have to limit the pay of executives and also the ability of shareholders to extract by law. It means that we need rules to protect people and planet. And the best companies should want to uplift that minimum set of rules. What does it mean for those of us in civil society? Here's the challenge. It means that ultimately our goal is to support, enable, and push for the provision of public services by accountable governments, not to run our own off-budget projects, however much we would like to have things that we control, that are made in our image. No country has ever moved to universal literacy or universally finishing school or universal healthcare without government driving it. So we need to support countries and challenge them in expanding their public services and ending user fees and making tax more progressive. It means being part of building power. It means being comfortable with generating discomfort, being okay with a bit of contention. Think about the disruptive change makers that you hear your friends complain about, and then think, how can I support those people? It means helping to craft a new story. Don't just think what the policy is. Think what's the phrase, what's the picture, what's the poster, what's the song lyric. It means courage, but it also means humility. Because change is never won by one person alone, it is not mostly about being the protagonist. It's about being the deuteragonist, the seconder, the buddy, the wingman, the enabler. That is how change happens. Lastly, one word on crises, because some people say to me, does this COVID crisis mean things will just get worse and worse? It could. Others say, does this COVID crisis mean, just like after the Second World War, or just like how following the AIDS crisis in Thailand, they moved to free healthcare, does this crisis mean an opportunity? Does this mean things will change? That could also be true. But there's no automaticity. So one way to think about crises is to think about heat. Social structures like metal and glass are hard, they are rigid, they are difficult to move. And so the ironmonger, the ironsmith, the blacksmith, or the glassblower, they place them under flame. They place the glass or the metal under flame. And then it becomes bendable, then it becomes movable. But in which direction will it bend? Well, that depends on which direction and how hard it is pushed. In other words, what will determine what happens about inequality because of this crisis, through this crisis, is not contingent on some external, abstract, material forces. It does not depend on leaders, great heroes who we're waiting for. It depends on you and me. Thanks.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you for your really, really insightful
insightful foray into your book, and I have read your book a couple of times, and I've earmarked it, and I'm quite and when it's very reflective for someone who's been in the sector, because you, as you shared, your book is divided in 3 parts, because history is a very important determiner of when we look at inequality. So one, I mean, talks about why we need to win the fight to begin with, and how have we won the fight before. So it's not to say inequality is a new issue, as you said. So it has been addressed in the past, and we learn. And then finally, why do we need to win it again? And I think for those of us in the development sector, it's again and again and again. We have to constantly reaffirm many of the things that we've learned and we hear. And I believe the audience is going to ask you questions, but I guess I would like to begin, Ben, and exercise my moderator privilege in that. Like I said, so your book was extremely, extremely useful for me, very reflective. And something in the book that you say really stood out to me, and it's towards the end as you're summarizing with your various examples. And I'd like to quote, it says, one of the biggest obstacles, you said, one of the biggest obstacles in fighting inequality is a widespread sense that however unfair inequality is, it can't be beaten, that it just is. And that's why it's so crucial to help reimagine a more equal society and help them see how it can be won. And this, Ben, I feel, end quote, but this I feel is extremely, is really a running thread for us for the forum. And often when we hear the word inequality, it seems to us that it's a huge and interactable issue that often as an individual effort will not solve it. So I as an individual, I as an institution, I as the government alone, I as a leader can't solve it. And for me, it's very important that there is, I guess, a question on the mindset shift also there. So can you just talk to me a little bit about that?
Thank you. Yeah, I think there's a number of things there. One is that there's no one-time event. Sometimes we think that we should be grateful to our ancestors, those who won the fight against inequality, because they took a problem and ended it. We should be grateful for them, but that's not why. We should be grateful for them because they taught us how to win it, how to beat it. They did it, and we have to do it again. The second part is around, in a way, messaging. Sometimes those of us who want to change things, we spend all our energies trying to communicate to people just how bad it is. And that is an important part of it. But the evidence shows that if you just tell people how bad things are, you can in fact lead them to despair. You need also to communicate to them that things can be better. And people will only believe that things can be better if they start to see things getting better. So one key part of campaigning effectively is to organize people around some, however small and however local, a process in which you come together and win something. Perhaps you protect a local park. Perhaps you improve something about the conditions of the schools in your area. Whatever it is, it's being involved in that together that gives people the confidence that things can change. And then lastly, I think when you say we can't on our own, you're absolutely right. But the flip side of that is that we can together. Sometimes people in social theory talk about structure and agency. Structure is all those things around us, and agency is about what we do. And the thing is that those are in an interrelationship. So structure does control our agency as individuals, but collectively, we can also, through our agency, change structure. So these things aren't the way they have to be. They're man-made and they can be human unmade. I'd love to look at some of the questions from the audience. I'm not sure if you'd like to read them out.
Sure. So one of the questions that have just come in by Ellie says, we all know that inequality has intersectional layers and we all aren't homogeneously equal or unequal in that sense. So could you speak a little bit more about that, especially from your experience?
Absolutely. So inequality intersects, and many people will experience inequality through a number of different dimensions. So let's say, for example, if you are an indigenous Guatemalan woman domestic worker in the US, you experience inequality racially, you experience inequality because of your migration status, you experience inequality because you're a woman, you experience inequality because you're a worker, and a worker with fewer rights than others. And all these intersect. We can't say that that woman's life is constrained and pushed upon because she is a woman, because she's Guatemalan, because she's a worker. It's for all of those reasons. And all of those different forms of inequality, they all hold her back. And so that's why an effective process to change her life requires tackling all of those aspects, not only one of them. Another really important part about that question of difference is that that difference also can lead us to be divided as ordinary people. And one of the ways in which the 1% manages to stay so dominant is that they play on those divides. They will say, for example, to workers from one ethnic or racial community that their biggest threat or enemy is workers of another ethnic or racial community. They will say to working class men that the threat to them is feminism. They will say to straight people who are stuck on poverty wages in insecure jobs without access to basic services, that what really threatens them is LGBT people. So these are the ways in which divide and rule really plays into the hands of the 1%. So those of us who want to tackle inequality need to do two things simultaneously. Firstly, we need to recognize that intersectionality and be committed to tackling all the inequalities that hold people back. And secondly, and complementarily, we have to be part of building what the Reverend William Barber in the US calls fusion coalitions, where you bring together different movements. This is why it's so exciting to see, for example, how folks that come from racial justice, from climate justice, from social justice are increasingly working together. That's the only way in which we have a chance of winning.
Right, I think quite profound there, one, recognizing this intersectionality, because that's very important. And of course, then building fusion coalitions. And I think that really leads into the next question that Altaf Devyati has asked us. And she says, the general excuse given to why strengthening or changing structures to tackle poverty and inequality is the lack of finance or subsidies, and that will only weaken the system. Especially, this is something which is quite rings true for developing countries. So insinuating that you can only improve when we are rich. And I think you have kind of, we touch on this during your keynote, but yes. Can you just talk a little bit more on that?
It's absolutely not true. I mean, in fact, the causality works the other way. It's not true that you need to develop in order to then, for example, provide education to your people. You have to wait until you can afford it. In fact, it's the flip side. You don't get to develop until you provide education for all of your people. When we look at some of the biggest changes, if you look at the example, the introduction of the welfare state in Europe, in most of Western Europe, it happens after World War II when they're all bankrupt. If you look at the biggest progressive change in the States, it happens in the 1930s. That's after the Wall Street crash. It's in fact often crises, after crises, because the politics shifts, because society shifts, that actually these things happen, which shows that these things are not contingent on some idea that there's a limited amount of money. It's just not true. The other is that how much money a government has is also contingent on how much it taxes and what you tax. And in most countries of the world, wealth is not taxed at all. So we tax income, we tax sales consumption, but we don't tax wealth at all. So there is money. The question is who has it, and how do you get it in the hands of those who need it?
Thanks, Ben. And I think the idea that you were mentioning, it absolutely is a myth. And in a past conversation with you, you'd also mentioned another myth that we think is regions that don't have conflict in that sense are ideally considered to be largely more equal, and therefore you won't see much of a resistance. But your book does, on the other hand, give several examples to prove otherwise. Another question, I think, from Kevin, Rohan, Thomas, which is, how do we onboard these fence-sitters, the ones who are mildly concerned about inequality or do not have an opinion about it, to join the bandwagon? Is there an approach, a strategy that we can specifically address them?
Yes. In fact, those are the most important people. So sometimes people think that faced with an unequal society, what you need to do is to appeal to those in charge. That doesn't work. Others think that they need to get stuck into arguments with their most militant opponents. That also, there's no point. The key people are the people in the middle. But the key lesson of how to win them is this. It's not a debate, it's a social process of accompanying them. And so you can't just say to people, I've got this idea, I want to persuade you, let me tell you why it's important. You have to, and this is a classic of union organizing, anyone who's worked in union organizing will say the same. What you need to do is to work out what matters to people. What is the injustice in their life that they feel holds them back? And then you say to them, what can we do about that together? And then you help them find allies for the injustice that concerns them. Now, once people get into the habit of organizing, of challenging, of seeking to tackle unfairness and of building coalitions, much easier then to bring them into a bigger picture conversation. But so I would say, in terms of organizing what you call the fence sitters, you're absolutely right. They are the key group. They're the people that make a difference. But the way to get them is not to try to bring them to your side, is to show that you are on their side. And the way that you show that you're on their side is by being by their side.
Thanks. I think just in the interest of time, a couple of last questions to you, Ben. There are several. Dr. Eddie has another question, which he says, reducing inequalities requires transformative change, greater efforts to eradicate poverty, hunger, health, education, social protection, jobs, especially for the younger people. And this is an important issue for us here in Malaysia also. What would be the best way for you, best way forward for policy decision makers to prioritize this inequality?
Great. So the challenge for policymakers is they do need to do all of those things. There isn't one single silver bullet. So what they need is they need to be able to sustain a coalition over time. One of the things that they need to get away from thinking is that they'll do it all on their own. They also need to get away from the idea that people putting pressure on them is bad, it's in the way, it's distracting them from the job. It's what enables them to do a great job. I think the most important reforms for a policymaker to pursue are those that change the power equation. So, for example, if you strengthen the ability of workers to organize in trade unions, if you strengthen the power of organized communities, women's groups, social movements, and others in order to be able to challenge, you in fact strengthen your ability to bring about transformative change. So my key message to policymakers would be, this is a long-term process. There is no silver bullet. You need to do a bunch of things. And the people who are challenging you, they're not your enemies. They are your greatest allies. Work with them, enable them, strengthen them.
Thank you, Ben. I think that kind of leads us into the last question by Shruti, which says, the pandemic has made countries, society, governments look inwards to protect their own shores, leaving a huge gap to tackle global inequality, which is quite true. Do you see this as a long-term challenge on taking on worldwide inequalities?
We have to, and it's such a huge mistake of countries to turn inwards. I mean, a classic, for example, is what we see with COVID-19, where Western countries feel that in order to protect themselves, they have to neglect the rest of the world. That isn't how infectious diseases work. They are guaranteeing that their own people are more at risk because of their national selfishness and because they're insisting on protecting the patents of a few companies. Inequality cannot be tackled in one place. We will either win this together or we will lose it. I'm confident that we can win, but whether we do win in the end is a question about whether we take it up. If we wait for the best policymakers, if we wait for those others to arrive, then we'll just be stuck waiting. But if we take that responsibility on ourselves, then we can win all of these things that people have been raising today. And I think the people here, the people in this conversation, are a great group of people from which this can begin.
Yes, and that's quite true. And I'd just perhaps like to close. That's all the time that we have for today, Ben. I think there are several questions that I have and there are others coming up. But I guess just like to close with something that you just mentioned, to say either we win this together or we lose, and that's so true. And that's something Hasanah is also doing, trying to look at collaborations, which is the way forward in any case. So thank you, Ben. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your sharing with us today. Hope we get more time to catch up at a different time. Thank you all for joining.
Thanks, everybody. Take care. Have a wonderful day.